Story 1. The passenger who wasn't there. Late nights on the bus are always the quietest. You can hear every creak of the vehicle, every sway as it turns down dimly lit streets. It's a strange kind of loneliness when you're surrounded by people, but they're not talking. On that night, I was on the last route of the day. The clock was creeping closer to midnight. Just a few passengers scattered around, lost in their own worlds. I pulled up the usual stop, a dim street corner where the light flickered overhead. It wasn't busy, but there was always someone waiting there, no matter the time. That night, it was a man I'd never seen before. Tall, wearing a long coat, and the kind of hat that casts a shadow over his face. He stepped onto the bus quietly, his eyes hidden beneath the brim. It was nothing unusual at first. You see all kinds of people at night, especially when you're driving a late route. The kind of people who avoid eye contact, like they're hiding something. But something about him felt off. It was hard to describe, but a cold sensation washed over me. I couldn't shake it. I kept glancing back through the rear-view mirror, watching him sit down in the seat right in front of the back door. His body was completely still. No shifting, no looking out the window, just silence. The bus was almost completely empty, save for a few regulars dozing off in their seats. I focused back on the road, trying to shake off the unease, but my eyes kept darting back to him. I couldn't help it. It was like he wasn't supposed to be there. As I passed the next few stops, I glanced back again, and that's when I noticed it. He was gone. I didn't see him get off, and the seat where he had been sitting was now completely empty. My heart started to race. I pulled over at the next light and checked the rear-view mirror again. Still no sign of him. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I'd imagined it. But then the feeling hit me again, the icy, suffocating sense that something wasn't right. I kept driving, hoping that I was just overthinking it. But when I hit the final stop and the bus was completely empty, I felt the weight of it. I walked through the aisles, checking each seat, even the back one where he'd been. Nothing. I can't explain what happened that night, but I know this. There was no way that man got off at any of those stops. There were no other people on the road. And when I drove back past that same street corner where he'd gotten on, it was just as empty as it had been before. I've done this route hundreds of times, but that night still haunts me. Every time I pass that stop now, I swear I feel that cold sensation again. And every time I look for him, but he's never there. Story 2. The Echoes of the Past. It was a stormy night. The kind where the rain hits the windows so hard it feels like the world is closing around you. I was behind the wheel of my bus, doing the usual late-night run, but the weather made everything feel heavier, more oppressive. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car passing by. I remember the sound of the rain and the soft hum of the wipers as they swiped across the windshield in slow, rhythmic intervals. I pulled into a stop near an old, abandoned station, one that had been shut down for years. The building was falling apart, its windows cracked and boarded up, but there was something about it that always made me uneasy. I never stopped there unless I had to, but that night I saw people waiting by the old platform. A group of passengers boarded, mostly quiet, their faces hidden under hoods and scarves. But there was one woman at the back, an older woman who stood out. Her eyes were distant, as if she were staring into something far beyond the bus. She seemed out of place, almost as if she didn't belong in the here and now. She sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the window as the storm raged outside. As the bus pulled away from the station, I caught a glimpse of the old building again. The flickering light from the bus casting long shadows against its cracked walls. That's when the woman spoke. "This place, it's never been the same since the fire," she said, her voice soft but clear. I didn't respond at first, thinking she was talking about the state of the station. But then she repeated herself, this time with more intensity. "Since the fire, it's never been the same." I turned to ask her what she meant, but when I did, she was gone. Just gone. No sign of her. No movement in the seat. I thought I'd imagined it, but I quickly checked the rear-view mirror. There was no one there. The seat was completely empty, as if she had never been there at all. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. I got up and walked down the aisle, checking every seat. Nothing. Just a few regular passengers who hadn't even noticed the woman's absence. When I finally got to my next stop, I did what I should have done earlier. I looked up the history of that old station, and what I found shocked me. There was indeed a fire there years ago, one that had left the building in ruins. The fire had been devastating, and many had died in it. But here's the thing. The woman in the back of my bus, the one who spoke about the fire, she couldn't have known about it. The station had been closed for decades by then. No one had mentioned it to her. I haven't stopped at that station since that night, and every time I drive past it, I can't help but wonder, was she really there? Or was she just an echo from the past, a reminder of something that should never have been forgotten? Story 3, The Silent Rider. The night had a way of making everything feel heavier. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when everything seems abandoned. The moonlight spilled over the streets like a blanket, casting long shadows, while the soft of the bus engine was the only sound breaking the silence. It was one of those nights where you could feel the weight of time slowing down, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The bus was practically empty, just a few souls heading home after long days, slumped in their seats, their eyes barely open. As usual, I wasn't really paying attention to any of them. I had my routine. I knew who would get off at each stop, when the streets would start getting quieter. But that night, something was different. I noticed her as soon as I pulled up to the stop. She was standing there, under the flickering street lamp, a woman, dressed in a red coat that looked a little out of place in the dark. She was tall, but the coat swallowed her figure, making her look almost skeletal. I couldn't make out her face, as it was hidden behind a mass of dark hair that hung low, covering most of her features. She stepped onto the bus with a quiet grace, moving so slowly it almost felt like she wasn't really walking, just gliding. I didn't think much of it at first. People get on late all the time, but there was something about her that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Maybe it was the way she didn't say anything when she walked past. No nod, no thank you, nothing, just silence. She chose a seat near the back, the very last row, and sat down with her hands resting on her lap. I kept an eye on her through the rear-view mirror as I drove. At first, everything seemed normal, but as I drove further down the road, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. She hadn't moved. Not once. She didn't shift in her seat, didn't look out the window, didn't even adjust her hair. She just sat there, completely still, her face hidden, her presence almost unnatural. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't stop glancing back. There was something in the stillness that bothered me, something that didn't sit right. Everyone else on the bus was just going about their business, half asleep, barely paying attention, but my eyes kept darting back to her. That same unbroken silence. It was like time itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I pulled up to the next stop. The streets empty, not a soul in sight. I glanced at her again through the mirror. Still nothing. Just that stillness, like she wasn't even breathing. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I opened the doors, my heart starting to race. I was already dreading the moment when I looked back and find her gone. And then when I turned to check the seat, it hit me. She wasn't there. The seat was empty, the red coat gone, as if she had never been there in the first place. I froze. My pulse raced as I quickly checked the aisle. There was no sign of her, no movement, no trace of anyone leaving. I stood up from my seat, panic creeping up my throat, and walked down the aisle, looking behind the seats, checking the back of the bus. Nothing. She had simply vanished. I thought maybe she had slipped off at one of the earlier stops without me noticing. But as I retraced my route, every stop, every corner, I found nothing. No sign of her. I even checked the bus cameras when I got back. But when I rewound the footage, I couldn't find her on any of it. The seat where she had been sitting was empty the whole time. But it wasn't just that. It was a feeling, that feeling of being watched, even though I was completely alone in the bus. That feeling that someone was standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. The silence, the stillness, everything about that moment felt wrong. And it didn't end there. Every time I drive that route now, I feel it. That same unease, that same coldness. I can't shake it. I look into the rear view mirror, hoping not to see her again. But sometimes when the bus is quiet and the night is still, I swear I can feel her presence again. And sometimes, I think I hear the faintest whisper from the back of the bus. But when I look, there's nothing. Story 4, The Vanishing Station. It was just another night on the route, or at least it should have been. The bus was quiet, the road long and winding, with only the occasional streetlight flickering in the distance. I was used to the solitude, the endless stretch of dark roads that seemed to go on forever. But that night, something happened that I couldn't explain. It was around 2 a.m., and I was nearing one of my usual stops. This place was always empty, a forgotten corner of the city that barely saw any traffic. The bus had made this stop dozens of times, and I knew exactly who would be waiting. No one. It was a strange little place, the kind of stop where you wouldn't expect anyone to be. But there she was. I saw her standing by the curb as I approached, a woman dressed in a long coat, with her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She was standing perfectly still, almost too still, as if waiting for something. Her face was familiar, but I couldn't place it at first. There was something about her smile, something in her eyes that seemed oddly comforting yet unsettling at the same time. As the bus slowed down, I opened the doors. The woman stepped aboard with a soft thank you, her eyes meeting mine as she passed. "Thank you for picking me up," she said in a quiet, almost serene voice. I nodded, not thinking much of it. It was late, and my brain was running on autopilot. But as she walked down the aisle to sit down, that's when it hit me, her smile. It was the same smile I remember from years ago, from the first route I ever drove. She had been one of the regular passengers back then, someone I had seen nearly every night for months. I couldn't believe it. She had vanished without a trace years ago. She had stopped riding the bus. No explanation. No farewell. I glanced at her again as she settled into a seat near the back. Her eyes were closed, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind them, like memories I didn't want to remember. But when I looked again, she was staring straight ahead, completely still. I couldn't tear my eyes off her. I continued driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't get her out of my mind. The bus stopped at the next few stations, but she never moved. She didn't even look at the windows as we passed familiar streets. I looked back once more, and that's when it happened. She was gone. Just like that. I couldn't believe it. I pulled over the side of the road and got out of the bus, walking up and down the aisle, checking every seat. She wasn't there. The seat where she had been sitting was completely empty. I went to the back of the bus, checked the doors, even the luggage compartment. Nothing. No sign of her at all. I thought I was losing my mind. How could she have vanished? There was no way she had gotten off at the previous stop. I had been watching the road the entire time. And when I checked the CCTV footage later, she wasn't on it. She had simply disappeared. But the strangest part? The next night, I pulled into that same stop, and there she was again, standing at the curb just like the night before. I opened the doors, and she stepped onto the bus, smiling at me. But this time, I didn't say anything. I just stared at her, unable to say a word. She walked down the aisle, sat in the same seat, and closed her eyes. And the whole time, I felt like I was stuck in some kind of loop, one that I couldn't escape from. I never told anyone about it. Who would believe me? But I haven't been able to stop thinking about her. Every time I pass that station, I look for her. I can't help it, but she's never there anymore. At least, I don't think she is.